Deep in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, hidden within a hollow so deep that sunlight barely touched the valley floor for more than 4 hours each day, there existed a family whose very existence defied the natural order of human biology. To the few outsiders who dared speak of them, they were known as the Crenshaws, and their story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American genetic history. It was 1931, when Drive Harold Whitmore, a young public health officer from Louisville, first received reports of something deeply wrong in Bledsoe Hollow. Local miners had spoken in hushed whispers about a family living in complete isolation. A family where children entered the world with eyes that never fully developed, where limbs grew twisted, and where silence had become the primary form of communication because so many had been born deaf. In his personal journals, Dr. Whitmore documented his first encounter with meticulous detail. Check if you have not subscribed to this channel. Kindly subscribe to this channel for more such videos. Records that would only surface decades later within the archives of the Kentucky Department of Public Health. What he discovered in that hollow would haunt him for the remainder of his professional career. The Crenshaw family had settled in Bledsoe Hollow in 1847 when Ezekiel Crenshaw and his wife Martha claimed 40 acres of land so remote that the nearest neighbor was a 2-day journey on horseback. They had come seeking isolation, fleeing something in their past that Ezekiel never spoke of, not even to his own children. What they found was a prison of their own making, a geographic trap that would seal the genetic fate of their descendants for generations. The hollow itself was a geographical anomaly, a narrow valley surrounded on 3 sides by steep mountain ridges rising over 2,000 feet. The only access was through a narrow gap that flooded during spring rains and became impassable with snow for nearly 5 months of the year. This natural barrier would become the architect of tragedy. Ezekiel and Martha had 7 children who survived infancy in an era when travel was difficult and social connections were limited to those within walking distance. The children grew up knowing no one outside their immediate family. When the eldest son Jeremiah reached marrying age, there were no suitable partners available. The nearest town was Hazard, over 30 miles of treacherous mountain terrain away. The family had no horses, no wagon, and no money for such luxuries. The decision that would echo through generations was made in the winter of 1869. Check if you have not subscribed to this channel. Kindly subscribe to this channel for more such videos. Jeremiah Crenshaw married his youngest sister, Prudence. The family Bible, which Dr. Whitmore would later examine with trembling hands, recorded the union with no apparent shame or hesitation. In the isolation of Bledsoe Hollow, such arrangements had become not just acceptable, but inevitable. Dr. Whitmore's journal entry from March 15, 1931, describes his first sight of the Crenshaw homestead. The main cabin was a deteriorating structure of hand-hewn logs surrounded by smaller outbuildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life in a landscape that felt abandoned by civilization itself. What struck him first was the silence. There were no children playing, no dogs barking, none of the sounds of daily life one would expect from a family compound. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he approached. The first family member to emerge was a woman he estimated to be in her 30s, though her face bore the weathered lines of someone much older. She stood in the doorway, her head tilted at an odd angle, and it took Dr. Whitmore a moment to realize her eyes were not looking at him. They could not look at anything. Where her eyes should have been, there were only shallow depressions covered by thin, translucent skin. She had been born without fully formed orbital structures, a condition known as anophthalmia. In his medical career, Dr. Whitmore had seen this condition exactly twice, both times in individual cases attributed to random genetic mutation. What he was about to discover in Bledsoe Hollow defied all statistical probability. The woman, who he would later learn was named Comfort Crenshaw, called out in a voice that was strangely melodic, almost as if she were singing rather than speaking. Within minutes, more family members emerged from the cabin and surrounding structures. Dr. Whitmore counted 17 individuals in total, ranging from elderly to infant. Of these 17, 11 showed obvious physical abnormalities. 6 had varying degrees of visual impairment, from partial sight to the complete absence of eyes. For had severe skeletal deformities, their spines curved in dramatic arcs that forced them to walk in shuffling, painful gaits. 3 appeared to have significant cognitive impairments, their expressions vacant and their responses delayed. Most disturbing to Dr. Whitmore was a young child, perhaps 4 years old, who sat in the dirt outside the main cabin. The child had no eyes, no visible ears, and hands that ended in fused digits resembling mittens more than human appendages. Yet, the child was alive, breathing, existing in a world of complete sensory isolation. Dr. Whitmore would spend 3 days in Bledsoe Hollow during that first visit, documenting what he could, trying to piece together the genetic puzzle that had created this family. What he uncovered was a pattern of consanguineous unions spanning 4 generations. A family tree that had turned in on itself so completely that it resembled less a tree and more a tangled knot. The marriage between Jeremiah and Prudence had produced 8 children, 6 of whom survived. These 6 had married among their first cousins, the children of Ezekiel and Martha's other offspring who remained in the hollow. The next generation continued the pattern, with siblings marrying siblings when cousins were not available. By 1931, the Crenshaw family had been intermarrying for over 60 years. The genetic consequences had accumulated with each generation, recessive genes that would normally remain hidden finding their fatal expression when 2 carriers inevitably united. Check if you have not subscribed to this channel, kindly subscribe to this channel for more such videos. The condition that Dr. Whitmore termed Crenshaw syndrome in his reports was not a single disorder but a constellation of abnormalities resulting from the extreme genetic narrowing. The eye malformations were the most visible, but they were accompanied by cardiac defects, kidney abnormalities, skeletal dysplasia, and profound developmental delays. What made the Crenshaw case particularly significant to medical history was not just the severity of the manifestations, but the family's complete acceptance of their condition. They had lived in isolation for so long that they had developed their own systems of communication, their own methods of survival, their own understanding of normalcy that bore no resemblance to the outside world. Comfort Crenshaw, the first woman Dr. Whitmore encountered, served as the family's primary communicator with the outside world. Despite her blindness, she had developed an extraordinary ability to navigate her environment through sound and touch. She could identify each family member by the sound of their footsteps. She could find her way through the dense forest surrounding the hollow by the smell of different plants and the feel of the terrain beneath her feet. She told Dr. Whitmore the family's history in a matter-of-fact tone that chilled him to his core. She spoke of her own parents, who had been siblings. She spoke of her grandparents, who had been first cousins. She recited the family genealogy as if it were the most natural thing in the world, unaware that what she was describing was a genetic catastrophe of almost unprecedented proportions. The outside world had attempted to intervene in the Crenshaw family's affairs only twice before Dr. Whitmore's arrival. In 1893, a circuit preacher named Reverend Thomas Mullins had stumbled upon the hollow while trying to establish new congregations in remote areas. His letters to the Baptist Mission Board in Louisville described his horror at what he found, but his pleas for intervention fell on deaf ears. The Mission Board was overwhelmed with requests, and a single isolated family in the mountains was not a priority. The second intervention came in 1912 when a coal company surveyor named James Patterson entered the hollow while mapping potential mining claims. Patterson's report to his supervisors mentioned the family briefly, noting they were peculiar in appearance and manner and recommending the company avoid any dealings with them. The hollow contained no significant coal deposits anyway, and the family was left undisturbed. Dr. Whitmore was different. As a public health officer, he had both the authority and the obligation to investigate conditions that posed threats to community health. Yet, as he prepared to leave Bledsoe Hollow after his initial visit, he found himself facing an ethical dilemma that would define the rest of his career. The Crenshaw family was not a threat to the broader community. They had no contact with anyone outside their hollow. They were not spreading disease or causing harm to others. They were simply existing in their own way, according to their own rules, in a place the rest of the world had forgotten. But they were also suffering. The children born with severe abnormalities experienced short, painful lives. The adults who survived faced constant health challenges. The entire family existed in a state of perpetual medical crisis with no access to care, no understanding of why their children were born the way they were, and no hope of change. Dr. Whitmore's official report, filed with the Kentucky Department of Public Health in April 1931, recommended immediate intervention. He called for the removal of the children to state institutions where they could receive proper medical care. He recommended sterilization of the adults to prevent further births, a practice that was legal and widely accepted in that era. He suggested that the property be condemned and the remaining family members relocated to supervised facilities. His recommendations were never implemented. The Great Depression had drained government resources to the breaking point. The state of Kentucky had neither the money nor the personnel to undertake such an ambitious intervention in a remote hollow that most officials had never heard of. Dr. Whitmore's report was filed, acknowledged, and forgotten. The Crenshaw family continued to exist in Bledsoe Hollow, continuing their patterns of intermarriage, continuing to produce children who bore the accumulated genetic burden of generations of consanguinity. The outside world moved on through depression and war and social upheaval, while in that forgotten hollow, time seemed to stand still. It would be another 23 years before anyone from the outside world would take serious interest in the Crenshaw family again. When that interest finally came, it would arrive in the form of a young geneticist whose research would expose the full, horrifying scope of what isolation and consanguinity had wrought. Dr. Elizabeth Monroe was 28 years old in the summer of 1954 when she first heard the name Crenshaw. She was completing her doctoral research at Johns Hopkins University, studying the inheritance patterns of recessive genetic disorders in isolated populations. Her advisor, the renowned geneticist Dr. William Neal, had mentioned in passing that Kentucky's Appalachian region contains several families that might prove valuable for research. Elizabeth had grown up in Baltimore, the daughter of a surgeon and a schoolteacher. Her world was one of education, progress, and scientific rationality. Nothing in her background had prepared her for what she would find in Bledsoe Hollow. She arrived in Hazard, Kentucky, on June 3, 1954, driving a borrowed Ford station wagon loaded with medical equipment, research supplies, and a determination to document whatever she found with scientific precision. The local health department had provided her with Dr. Whitmore's original report from 1931, a document that had sat untouched in a filing cabinet for over 2 decades. Reading that report in her hotel room the night before her expedition to the Hollow, Elizabeth felt a mixture of skepticism and anticipation. Surely Dr. Whitmore had exaggerated. Surely the conditions he described could not exist in modern America. Surely someone would have done something in the intervening years. The journey to Bledsoe Hollow took nearly 6 hours, though the distance was less than 40 miles. The roads degraded from paved to gravel to dirt to mere suggestions of paths through dense forest. Elizabeth had to stop 3 times to clear fallen branches from her route. By the time she reached the narrow gap that served as the hollow's entrance, her hands were blistered from gripping the steering wheel, and her confidence was shaken. What she found exceeded her worst expectations. The Crenshaw family had grown in the 23 years since Drive Whitmore's visit, where he had counted 17 individuals. Elizabeth documented 31. 2 more cabins had been constructed, crude structures of salvaged lumber and river stone. The original homestead had deteriorated further, its roof patched with tar paper and flattened tin cans. But it was the people who stopped Elizabeth in her tracks. The first generation that Dr. Whitmore had documented, those who had been adults in 1931, were now elderly or deceased. The children he had observed had grown and reproduced, and their children had done the same. The genetic bottleneck had tightened with each passing generation. Elizabeth's field notes, which would later form the basis of a landmark paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics, describe her initial observations with a clinical detachment that barely masks her emotional turmoil. Subject 1a, female, approximately 45 years of age, complete bilateral anophthalmia, severe kyphoscoliosis, deaf in left ear, cognitive function appears normal. Subject reports being married to Subject 1b, identified as her full biological brother. They have produced 7 offspring, 4 of whom survive. Subject 2c, male approximately 12 years of age. Microcephaly with cranial circumference measuring 42 centimeters, significantly below normal for age. Eyes present but non-functional with severe cataracts and apparent optic nerve hypoplasia. Webbed fingers on both hands. Unable to communicate verbally. Subject is the offspring of Subject 1a and Subject 1b***. Page after page of Elizabeth's notes catalogued the devastating effects of generations of consanguineous unions. She documented cardiac murmurs in over half the family members she examined. She found kidney abnormalities in several individuals. She recorded seizure disorders, skeletal malformations, and developmental delays that ranged from mild to profound. But what struck Elizabeth most powerfully was not the catalogue of medical conditions. It was the family's adaptation to their circumstances. The Crenshaws had developed a sophisticated system of mutual support that allowed even their most severely affected members to survive. Those with sight guided those without. Those who could hear translated sounds into touch signals for the deaf. Those with normal cognitive function cared for those who could not care for themselves. They had created a society unto themselves, with its own norms, its own values, its own understanding of what it meant to be human. In their world, blindness was not a disability to be mourned, but simply a characteristic to be accommodated. In their world, the twisted spines and fused fingers that Elizabeth saw as deformities were simply how people looked. Comfort Crenshaw was now in her 50s, and she remained the family's primary interface with the outside world. She remembered Dr. Whitmore's visit with perfect clarity, describing his appearance, his voice, even the smell of his tobacco. She had developed her memory to compensate for her lack of sight, and she could recall conversations from decades past with startling accuracy. Elizabeth spent 3 weeks in Bledsoe Hollow during that first summer, returning to her hotel in Hazard each evening to transcribe her notes and process what she had witnessed. She drew blood samples from every family member who would consent, planning to analyze them for blood type patterns that might reveal the extent of genetic sharing within the family. The blood typing results, when she completed them back at Johns Hopkins, confirmed what she had suspected. The Crenshaw family showed a pattern of genetic homogeneity that was almost unprecedented in human populations. Rare blood type variants that should have appeared in only a fraction of the population were present in nearly every family member, indicating that they all descended from an extremely limited genetic pool. But Elizabeth's research went beyond simple blood typing. She constructed a comprehensive family pedigree, a diagram showing the relationships between every member of the Crenshaw family going back to Ezekiel and Martha's original settlement in 1847. What emerged was a tangled web of consanguineous unions that defied easy comprehension. In a normal family tree, each generation represents a mixing of genetic material from two unrelated families. But in the Crenshaw pedigree, the lines folded back on themselves repeatedly. The same ancestors appeared multiple times in each individual's lineage. Elizabeth calculated that by the 4th generation, the average Crenshaw had an inbreeding coefficient of over 0.25, meaning they were more closely related to themselves than most first cousins would be. The 5th generation, the children being born in the 1950s, had inbreeding coefficients approaching 0.35. At this level, the probability of 2 copies of any given recessive gene coming together in the same individual was dramatically elevated. It was a genetic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion, with each generation more affected than the last. Elizabeth's research attracted attention from the academic community, but also from government officials who had very different interests in the Crenshaw family. The 1950s were the height of the American eugenics movement, and families like the Crenshaws were viewed as examples of why genetic intervention was necessary. In October 1954, Elizabeth received a letter from the Kentucky State Board of Health requesting she provide her research materials to support a petition for mandatory sterilization of the Crenshaw family. The board cited the family as a public health threat and argued that preventing future births was the only humane solution. Elizabeth refused. She had spent enough time with the Crenshaw family to understand they were not a public health threat. They were an isolated population facing a genetic crisis. But they were also human beings with dignity and rights. The idea of forcibly sterilizing them without their understanding or consent violated everything she believed about medical ethics. Her refusal cost her professionally. Dr. Neal, her advisor, distanced himself from her research. The funding she had applied for to continue her studies was denied. Her paper on the Crenshaw family, when finally published in 1956, was heavily edited to remove any content that might be seen as sympathetic to the family. But Elizabeth continued to visit Bledsoe Hollow. She returned every summer for the next decade, documenting the births and deaths, the progression of conditions, and the family's remarkable resilience in the face of circumstances that would have destroyed most communities. In 1958, she witnessed the birth of a child who would come to symbolize both the tragedy and the strange beauty of the Crenshaw family. The child, a girl named Grace, was born to parents who were full siblings. She entered the world blind, deaf, and with a heart defect that doctors in any major hospital would have identified as life-threatening. But Grace survived. She grew. She thrived in her own way. She became part of the intricate web of mutual support that held the Crenshaw family together. Elizabeth documented Grace's development over the following years, watching as she learned to navigate her environment through touch alone, as she developed a system of communication with her family that required no sight or sound. Grace would live to the age of 19, far longer than anyone expected. When she died in 1977, it was from pneumonia, not from her heart condition. She had lived a life that most outsiders would view as tragically limited, but within the context of her family, she had been loved, valued, and complete. Elizabeth's research on the Crenshaw family would eventually fill 12 volumes of notebooks, hundreds of photographs, and dozens of blood and tissue samples that she preserved for future analysis. She never published the comprehensive study she had planned, deterred by the political climate of the era and her own conflicted feelings about exposing the family to further scrutiny. The notebook sat in her private collection until her death in 2003. It was only then that the full scope of what she had documented became available to researchers, revealing a story of human isolation and genetic consequence that remains one of the most extensively documented cases of its kind in American medical history. The year was 1967, and America was changing in ways that would finally reach even the most isolated corners of Appalachia. President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty had directed unprecedented resources toward the mountain communities of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Young volunteers from VISTA, the Domestic Peace Corps, were fanning out into hollows and valleys that had been forgotten for generations. It was a VISTA volunteer named Michael Chen who rediscovered the Crenshaw family. Michael was 22, a recent graduate of Columbia University with a degree in social work and an idealistic belief that poverty could be eliminated through education and opportunity. He had been assigned to Leslie County, Kentucky, tasked with identifying families who might benefit from the new federal programs. A local minister in Hazard mentioned the family in the hollow, warning Michael to stay away. The mountain people had their own way of dealing with such things, the minister said. Outsiders only made things worse. Michael, of course, did not listen. His first visit to Bledsoe Hollow came on a September afternoon when the mountains were just beginning to show their autumn colors. Unlike Dr. Whitmore and Elizabeth Monroe, Michael had no medical training, no scientific framework through which to process what he was about to see. He had only his idealism and his conviction that every American deserved access to the opportunities that the Great Society promised. What he found shattered something inside him. The Crenshaw family had now been intermarrying for over a century. The genetic consequences that Elizabeth had documented in the 1950s had continued to accumulate. Of the 43 individuals Michael counted in the hollow that day, only 7 had what he would describe as a normal appearance. The rest showed varying degrees of the abnormalities that had come to define the family: missing or malformed eyes, curved spines, fused digits, shortened limbs. Michael's report to his VISTA supervisors was passionate and urgent. He demanded immediate intervention. He called for medical teams, social workers, educational resources. He painted a picture of a community in crisis that required nothing less than a full-scale rescue operation. The response from Washington was slower than he hoped, but more comprehensive than anyone expected. The Office of Economic Opportunity, which oversaw the poverty programs, designated the Crenshaw family as a special case requiring multi-agency coordination. A team was assembled that included physicians, social workers, educators, and legal experts. They arrived in Bledsoe Hollow in February 1968, a convoy of government vehicles that had to be abandoned a mile from the settlement because the road became impassable. They hiked the remaining distance through snow that reached their knees, arriving at the Crenshaw homestead as the winter sun was setting. What followed was one of the most complicated and controversial social interventions in Appalachian history. The team's initial assessment confirmed what Michael had reported. The family was living in conditions that violated every standard of health and safety. The cabins had no running water, no electricity, no sanitation facilities beyond outhouses that had been used for generations. Food was scarce, consisting mainly of what could be hunted, gathered, or grown in the thin mountain soil. But the team also found something they had not expected, a functional community. Despite their isolation, despite their poverty, despite their physical challenges, the Crenshaws had created a society that worked. They had systems for food production, for child care, for caring for their elderly and disabled. They had a culture with songs and stories and traditions that had been passed down through generations. The lead physician on the team, Dr. Robert Hawkins, documented his findings in a report that would later become a key text in debates about medical ethics and cultural sensitivity. He noted that while the family's living conditions were objectively poor, their health outcomes were in some ways better than those of other impoverished Appalachian communities. Infant mortality, while high, was lower than he expected given the complete absence of prenatal care. Life expectancy, while reduced, was not dramatically so for those who survived childhood. Dr. Hawkins attributed these outcomes to the family's social structure. No one was left alone. No one was abandoned. Even the most severely affected individuals received constant care and attention from their relatives. In a strange way, the genetic conditions that bound the family also created the bonds of mutual dependence that allowed them to survive. The intervention team faced an impossible choice. They could remove the children to foster care or institutions, breaking up a family that had been together for over a century. They could force medical treatment on adults who did not understand or consent to such treatment. They could attempt to educate a population that had developed its own ways of knowing that bore no resemblance to standard curricula. Or they could try something different. The compromise they developed was innovative for its time, though it would later be criticized from all sides. Rather than removing family members from the hollow, they would bring services to the family. A small clinic would be established at the edge of the settlement. Teachers would visit to provide basic education. Social workers would help connect the family with benefits they were entitled to receive. The plan required the family's cooperation, which was far from guaranteed. Comfort Crenshaw, now in her 60s and the unquestioned matriarch of the family, was deeply suspicious of the outsiders. She remembered Dr. Whitmore's visit and the talk of sterilization that had followed. She had heard from Elizabeth Monroe about the government officials who wanted to prevent the family from having children. Michael Chen became the bridge between the two worlds. He spent months earning Comfort's trust, visiting the hollow regularly, learning the family's ways, understanding their fears. He learned to navigate the settlement blindfolded, following the paths by feel as the sightless Crenshaws did. He learned their songs, their stories, their names for the plants and animals that filled their world. It was during one of these visits that Comfort told him the story the family had never shared with outsiders before. The story of why Ezekiel Crenshaw had sought isolation in the first place. Ezekiel, she said, had been born with what the family called the mark. His eyes were different, set too closely together, and he had been born with fused toes on both feet. In the Virginia community where he grew up, such differences were seen as signs of divine displeasure. He had been shunned, mocked, treated as less than human. When he married Martha, who had her own subtle differences that marked her as an outsider, they fled. They sought a place where their differences would not matter, where they could live without the judgment of others. They found Bledsoe Hollow, and they made it their sanctuary. What they could not know was that the differences they carried were genetic. By marrying each other, two people who already carried recessive genes for various conditions, they set in motion the cascade of inheritance that would affect every subsequent generation. Their sanctuary became a trap, and their descendants paid the price. The intervention program lasted from 1968 to 1975. During those years, a small clinic operated at the edge of Bledsoe Hollow, staffed by rotating physicians and nurses who provided basic medical care to family members who chose to accept it. Teachers came twice a week to offer reading and arithmetic lessons to the younger children. Social workers helped the family navigate the bureaucracy required to receive food stamps and disability benefits. The results were mixed. Some family members embraced the services, particularly the younger generation who had grown up hearing Michael's stories about the world beyond the hollow. Others refused any contact with outsiders, retreating deeper into the settlement when visitors arrived. The birth rate, which Elizabeth Monroe had documented at alarming levels, began to decline. This was not due to any forced intervention, but rather to choices made by family members who had learned about contraception for the first time. Several young women chose to prevent pregnancy after learning about the genetic risks their children would face. But the pattern of consanguineous unions did not entirely stop. In a population where every potential partner was a close relative, preventing such unions entirely would have meant preventing all unions. Some family members continued to form relationships with their siblings or cousins, though now with more awareness of the potential consequences. The intervention program ended in 1975 when federal funding dried up and priorities shifted elsewhere. The clinic was closed. The teachers stopped coming. Michael Chen, who had devoted 7 years of his life to the Crenshaw family, was reassigned to an urban program in Louisville. The hollow fell silent again, but it was not the same silence as before. The family had been changed by their contact with the outside world. They had gained access to benefits that provided food and basic necessities. Some of the younger members had left, seeking lives in the towns beyond the mountains. Those who remained were older, fewer, and more aware of their place in a world that still did not fully accept them. By 1985, the Crenshaw family in Bledsoe Hollow had dwindled to 19 individuals. Deaths had outpaced births for over a decade, and the emigration of younger family members had accelerated after the intervention program ended. Those who remained were predominantly elderly or severely affected by the genetic conditions that had accumulated over generations. Comfort Crenshaw died in the winter of 1983 at an age that no one could precisely determine. She had been the last living connection to the family's origins, the last person who remembered the stories that Ezekiel and Martha had passed down about their flight from Virginia. With her death, much of the family's oral history was lost forever. The new matriarch was her daughter, Patience, a woman in her 50s who had been born deaf and blind but had developed an extraordinary ability to communicate through touch. Patience had never left the hollow, had never experienced the outside world in any direct way. Her understanding of reality was shaped entirely by what she could feel, taste, and smell within the narrow confines of Bledsoe Hollow. A journalist named Sarah Mitchell discovered the Crenshaw family in 1987 while researching a book about Appalachian poverty. Unlike the doctors and social workers who had come before, Sarah's interest was primarily documentary. She wanted to tell the family's story, to preserve it before the last witnesses to their unique way of life were gone. Sarah spent 6 months in and around Bledsoe Hollow, conducting interviews with family members who could communicate and with the healthcare workers and social workers who had been involved in the intervention program. She tracked down Elizabeth Monroe's research notes, Michael Chen's reports, and the official documents that chronicled the government's attempts to help the family. What emerged from her research was a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of tragedy that most outsiders assumed. Yes, the Crenshaw family had suffered enormously from the genetic consequences of their isolation. Yes, children had been born with conditions that caused them pain and shortened their lives. Yes, the family's poverty and lack of education had limited their options in ways that seemed cruel and unnecessary. But the family had also survived. For over a century, they had maintained a community in conditions that would have destroyed most groups. They had developed a culture, a system of values, a way of being in the world that allowed them to find meaning and connection despite their circumstances. They had loved each other in their way. They had cared for each other in their way. They had lived and died in a hollow that was the only world they ever knew. Sarah's book, The Hollow People, was published in 1990 to mixed reviews. Some critics praised her sensitive and nuanced portrayal of the family. Others accused her of romanticizing poverty and genetic disease. The Crenshaw family themselves, those who could understand the concept of a book, had mixed feelings about seeing their lives exposed to public scrutiny. The book brought renewed attention to Bledsoe Hollow, not all of it welcome. Curiosity seekers began making the difficult journey to see the inbred family for themselves. Most turned back when confronted with the reality of the terrain, but some made it through, disturbing the family's peace with cameras and questions. The final years of the Crenshaw family in Bledsoe Hollow were marked by a slow, inevitable decline. By 1995, only 7 family members remained in the hollow. The youngest was 42 years old. There would be no more children. The last Crenshaw to be born in Bledsoe Hollow was a man named Ezekiel, named for the original patriarch. He had been born in 1953 to parents who were full siblings. He was blind from birth with severe skeletal abnormalities that confined him to a wheelchair that could not navigate the rough terrain of the hollow. Ezekiel was interviewed by a documentary filmmaker in 1998, one of the last extensive records of a Crenshaw family member speaking about their experience. His words, captured on video, provide a window into a world that has since disappeared. "People think we was cursed," he said, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of the mountains. "But we was just people trying to live. We did not know what we was doing wrong. We just did what our parents did, and their parents before them. How's we supposed to know any different?" He spoke about his childhood, about learning to navigate a world without sight, about the sounds and smells and textures that made up his reality. He spoke about his family, the aunts and uncles and cousins who were also his siblings and half-siblings through the tangled lines of descent. He spoke about love, about the connections that bound the family together despite everything. "They say we should not have existed," he said. "They say it was wrong what our people did. Maybe it was. But we existed anyway. We lived. We loved. That has to count for something." Ezekiel died in 2002, one of the last Crenshaws to die in Bledsoe Hollow. By then, only 3 family members remained, all elderly, all severely affected by the genetic legacy of their ancestry. The final Crenshaw to live in the hollow was a woman named Mercy, who had been born in 1948. She was the granddaughter of Comfort, and like her grandmother, she was blind from birth. Unlike Comfort, who had been a fierce and capable leader of her family, Mercy had always been gentle and passive, content to be cared for by others. When the last of her relatives died in 2007, Mercy was alone in the hollow for the first time in its history. She was 60 years old, blind, and had never learned to care for herself. Social workers from the county, alerted by neighbors who had occasionally checked on the family, found her in the main cabin, thin and confused, but alive. Mercy was removed to a nursing home in Hazard, where she died 6 months later. She never spoke about her life in the hollow. She never seemed to fully understand why she had been taken from the only home she had ever known. With her death, the Crenshaw family of Bledsoe Hollow ceased to exist. The hollow itself remains, though time and nature have begun to reclaim what the Crenshaws built. The cabins have collapsed into piles of rotting timber. The cleared fields have been swallowed by forest. The paths that generations of blind Crenshaws navigated by touch have disappeared beneath undergrowth and fallen leaves. In 2015, a team from the University of Kentucky conducted an archaeological survey of the site, documenting what remained of the Crenshaw settlement. They found foundations, refuse middens, the remnants of the stone chimney that Dr. Whitmore had noted in 1931. They found fragments of pottery, rusted tools, and glass bottles that dated back to the late 19th century. They also found graves. The Crenshaws had buried their dead in a small clearing behind the main cabin, marking each grave with a simple stone. The survey team counted 67 graves in total, spanning from the 1850s to the early 2000s. Some stones bore names and dates carved in rough letters. Others were anonymous, marking the resting places of children who had died before they could be named. The genetic legacy of the Crenshaw family did not disappear with the last residents of Bledsoe Hollow. The family members who left the hollow over the decades carried their genes into the broader population. Some married outside the family, introducing their genetic variations into new lineages. Others clustered in communities not far from their ancestral home, maintaining some of the patterns of intermarriage that had defined their family for generations. Modern genetic testing has allowed researchers to trace the descendants of the original Crenshaws through the population of eastern Kentucky and beyond. A study published in 2019 identified over 300 individuals who carry significant genetic markers associated with the Crenshaw lineage. Most are unaware of their connection to the family in the hollow. The conditions that define the Crenshaws, the blindness, the skeletal abnormalities, the developmental delays, continue to appear occasionally in the region. Geneticists refer to this as the founder effect, the persistence of rare genetic variants in populations descended from a small number of ancestors. The Crenshaws were not the only isolated family in the Appalachian Mountains, and the genetic consequences of that isolation continue to ripple through generations. But the story of the Crenshaw family is not primarily a story about genetics. It is a story about isolation, about the ways that geography and poverty and social stigma can trap people in circumstances that become impossible to escape. It is a story about the limits of intervention, about the difficulty of helping people whose understanding of the world is fundamentally different from our own. It is a story about survival, about the remarkable human capacity to adapt to circumstances that would seem unbearable to outsiders. The Crenshaws did not choose their fate. They were born into a family in a place that constrained their choices in ways they could not fully understand. They did what humans have always done when faced with impossible circumstances: they survived. They adapted. They created meaning and connection within the boundaries of their world. Whether that survival was triumph or tragedy depends on one's perspective. To the doctors and social workers who tried to help them, the Crenshaws were victims of a preventable catastrophe, a family destroyed by ignorance and isolation. To some observers, they were examples of what happens when social controls fail, when communities do not intervene to prevent harmful patterns of behavior. But to the Crenshaws themselves, they were simply a family. They loved each other in their way. They cared for each other in their way. They lived and died in a hollow that was the only world they ever knew. The last entry in Elizabeth Monroe's research journals, written in 1964 after one of her final visits to Bledsoe Hollow, captures this complexity in words that remain haunting 6 decades later. I have studied this family for 10 years. I have documented their conditions, their relationships, their patterns of inheritance. I have calculated their inbreeding coefficients and predicted their offspring's chances of survival. I have done everything that science allows me to do, but I cannot answer the question that haunts me most, **. Were they happy? In their darkness, in their silence, in their isolation from everything I understand as normal human life? Did they find something that I, with all my sight and hearing and education, have missed? I do not know. I will never know. And perhaps that is the most important thing I have learned from the Crenshaw family, **. There are limits to what science can tell us about the human experience. There are depths to human resilience and adaptation that we cannot measure. There are forms of connection and meaning that exist beyond our understanding, **. The Crenshaws were not monsters. They were not curiosities. They were people shaped by circumstances beyond their control, making the best of a situation that most of us cannot imagine. Whatever judgment history renders on their choices, we should remember that they were human beings who deserved compassion, not condemnation. **. The hollow is silent now. The mountains rise around it as they have for millions of years, indifferent to the human drama that played out in their shadow. The streams still flow, the seasons still turn, and the forest slowly erases all evidence that the Crenshaw family ever existed. But their story remains. In the archives of the Kentucky Department of Public Health, in Elizabeth Monroe's notebooks, in the memories of the social workers and doctors and journalists who encountered them, in the genetic markers that persist in the population of eastern Kentucky, silent witnesses to a family that rose and fell in a hollow where sight itself seemed to disappear. The Appalachian family without eyes. The darkest legacy of generations of inbreeding. A story that challenges us to consider what it means to be human, what it means to belong, what it means to survive in a world that would prefer to forget that people like the Crenshaws ever existed. Their hollow remains. Their memory endures. And the questions they raise about isolation, about intervention, about the limits of compassion and the boundaries of belonging continue to demand answers that we may never be able to give.